Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
A Warning to the Curious by M.R. James. This story has kindly been sponsored by Gavin Critchley. The place on the east coast which the reader is asked to consider is Seaburgh. It is not very different now from what I remember it to have been when I was a child. Marshes intersected by dykes to the south, recalling the early chapters of Great Expectations. Flat fields to the north merging into heath, fir woods, and above all, gorse inland. A long seafront and a street. Behind that, a spacious church of flint with a broad solid western tower and a peal of 6 bells. How well I remember their sound on a hot Sunday in August, as our party went slowly up the white dusty slope of road towards them, for the church stands at the top of a short steep incline. They rang with a flat clacking sort of sound on those hot days, but when the air was softer they were mellower too. The railway ran down to its little terminus farther along the same road. There was a gay white windmill just before you came to the station, and another down near the shingle at the south end of the town, and yet others on higher ground to the north. There were cottages of bright red brick with slate roofs. But why do I encumber you with these commonplace details? The fact is that they come crowding to the point of the pencil when it begins to write of Seaburgh. I should like to be sure that I had allowed the right ones to get onto the paper, but I forgot. I have not quite done with the word-painting business yet. Walk away from the sea and the town, past the station and turn up the road on the right. It is a sandy road, parallel with the railway, and if you follow it, it climbs to somewhat higher ground. On your left, you are now going northward, is heath. On your right, the side towards the sea, is a belt of old firs, wind-beaten, thick at the top, with the slope that old seaside trees have. Seen on the skyline from the train, they would tell you in an instant, if you did not know it, that you were approaching a windy coast. Well, at the top of my little hill, a line of these firs strikes out and runs towards the sea, for there is a ridge that goes that way, and the ridge ends in a rather well-defined mound commanding the level fields of rough grass, and a little knot of fir trees crowns it. And here you may sit on a hot spring day, very well content to look at blue sea, white windmills, red cottages, bright green grass, church tower, and distant Martello tower on the south. As I have said, I began to know Seaburgh as a child, but a gap of a good many years separates my early knowledge from that which is more recent. Still, it keeps its place in my affections, and any tales of it that I pick up have an interest for me. One such tale is this. It came to me in a place very remote from Seaburgh, and quite accidentally, from a man whom I had been able to oblige, enough in his opinion, to justify his making me his confidant to this extent. "I know all that country more or less," he said. "I used to go up to Seaburgh pretty regularly for golf in the spring. I generally put up at the Bear with a friend, Henry Long it was. You knew him, perhaps?" "Slightly," I said. "And we used to take a sitting-room and be very happy there. Since he died, I haven't cared to go there. And I don't know that I should anyhow, after the particular thing that happened on our last visit. It was in April 19 we were there, and by some chance we were almost the only people in the hotel, so the ordinary public rooms were practically empty, and we were the more surprised when, after dinner, our sitting-room door opened and a young man put his head in. We were aware of this young man. He was rather a rabbity, anemic subject, light hair and light eyes, but not unpleasing. So when he said, 'I beg your pardon, is this a private room?' we did not growl and say, 'Yes, it is,' but Long said, or I did, no matter which, 'Please come in.' 'Oh, may I?' he said, and seemed relieved. Of course, it was obvious that he wanted company, And as he was a reasonable kind of person, and not the sort to bestow his whole family history on you, we urged him to make himself at home. "I dare say you find the other rooms rather bleak," I said. Yes, he did, but it was really too good of us, and so on. That being got over, he made some pretence of reading a book. Long was playing patience, I was writing. It became plain to me after a few minutes that this visitor of ours was in rather a state of fidgets or nerves, which communicated itself to me, and so I put away my writing and turned to at engaging him in talk. After some remarks, which I forget, he became rather confidential. "You'll think it very odd of me," this was the sort of way he began, "but the fact is I've had something of a shock." Well, I recommended a drink of some cheering kind, and we had it. The waiter, coming in, made an interruption, and I thought our young man seemed very jumpy when the door opened. But after a while he got back to his woes again. There was nobody he knew in the place, and he did happen to know who we both were, for it turned out there was some common acquaintance in town. And really he did want a word of advice, if we didn't mind. Of course we both said, "By all means," or "Not at all," and Long put away his cards, and we settled down to hear what his difficulty was. "It began," he said, "more than a week ago, when I bicycled over to Froston, only about 5 or 6 miles, to see the church. I'm very much interested in architecture, and it's got one of those pretty porches with niches and shields. I took a photograph of it, and then an old man who was tidying up in the churchyard came and asked if I'd care to look into the church. I said yes, and he produced a key and let me in. There wasn't much inside, but I told him it was a nice little church, and he kept it very clean. But, I said, the porch is the best part of it. We were just outside the porch then, and he said, "Ah, yes, that is a nice porch. And do you know, sir, what's the meaning of that coat of arms there?" It was the one with the 3 crowns, and though I'm not much of a herald, I was able to say yes. I thought it was the old arms of the kingdom of East Anglia. "That's right, sir," he said. "And do you know the meaning of them 3 crowns that's on it?" I said I'd no doubt it was known, but I couldn't recollect to have heard it myself. "Well then," he said, "for all that you're a scholard, I can tell you something you don't know. Them's the 3 holy crowns, what was buried in the ground near by the coast to keep the Germans from landing. Ah, I can see you don't believe that, but I tell you, if it hadn't been for one of them holy crowns being there still, them Germans would have landed here time and again, they would. Landed with their ships and killed man, woman and child in their beds. Now then, that's the truth, what I'm telling you, that is. And if you don't believe me, you ask the rector. There he comes. You asked him, I says." I looked round, and there was the rector, a nice-looking old man, coming up the path. And before I could begin assuring my old man, who was getting quite excited, that I didn't disbelieve him, the rector struck in and said, "What's this all about, John? Good day to you, sir. Have you been looking at our little church?" So then there was a little talk which allowed the old man to calm down, and then the rector asked him again what was the matter. "Oh," he said, "it weren't nothink, only I was telling this gentleman he'd ought to ask you about them holy crowns." "Ah, yes, to be sure," said the rector. "That's a very curious matter, isn't it? But I don't know whether the gentleman is interested in our old stories, eh?" "Oh, he'll be interested fast enough," says the old man. "He'll put his confidence in what you tells him, sir. Why, you known William Agee yourself, father and son too." Then I put in a word to say how much I should like to hear all about it. And before many minutes I was walking up the village street with the rector, who had 1 or 2 words to say to parishioners, and then to the rectory, where he took me into his study. He had made out, on the way, that I really was capable of taking an intelligent interest in a piece of folklore, and not quite the ordinary tripper. So he was very willing to talk, and it is rather surprising to me that the particular legend he told me has not made its way into print before. His account of it was this. There has always been a belief in these parts in the 3 holy crowns. The old people say they were buried in different places near the coast to keep off the Danes or the French or the Germans, and they say that one of the three was dug up a long time ago and another has disappeared by the encroaching of the sea, and one's still left doing its work, keeping off invaders. Well, now, if you have read the ordinary guides and histories of this county, you will remember perhaps that in 1687 a crown, which was said to be the crown of Redwald, king of the East Angles, was dug up at Rendlesham, and alas, melted down before it was even properly described or drawn. Well, Rendlesham isn't on the coast, but it isn't so very far inland, and it's on a very important line of access. And I believe that this is the crown which the people mean when they say that one has been dug up. Then, on the south, you don't want me to tell you where there was a Saxon royal palace which is now under the sea, eh? Well, there was the second crown, I take it. And up beyond these two, they say, lies the third. Do they say where it is? Of course, I asked. He said, yes, indeed they do, but they don't tell. And his manner did not encourage me to put the obvious question. Instead of that, I waited a moment and said, what did the old man mean when he said you knew William Ager, as if that had something to do with the crowns? To be sure, he said, now that's another curious story. Those Agers, it's a very old name in these parts, but I can't find that they were ever people of quality or big owners. These Agers say, or said, that their branch of the family were the guardians of the last crown. A certain old Nathaniel Ager was the first one I knew. I was born and brought up quite near here, and he, I believe, camped out at the place during the whole of the war in 1870. William, his son, did the same, I know, during the South African War, and young William, his son, who has only died fairly recently, took lodgings at the cottage nearest the spot, and I've no doubt hastened his end, for he was a consumptive by exposure and night-watching. And he was the last of that branch. It was a dreadful grief to him to think that he was the last, but he could do nothing. The only relations at all near to him were in the colonies. I wrote letters for him to them, imploring them to come over on business very important to the family, but there has been no answer. So the last of the Holy Crowns, if it's there, has no guardian now. That was what the rector told me, and you can fancy how interesting I found it. The only thing I could think of when I left him was how to hit upon the spot where the crown was supposed to be. I wish I'd left it alone. But there was a sort of fate in it, for as I bicycled back past the churchyard wall, my eye caught a fairly new gravestone, and on it was the name of William Ager. Of course I got off and read it. It said, of this parish, died at Seaburgh, 19, aged 28. There it was, you see. A little judicious questioning in the right place, and I should at least find the cottage nearest the spot. Only I didn't quite know what was the right place to begin my questioning at. Again, there was fate. It took me to the curiosity shop down that way, you know, and I turned over some old books, and if you please, one was a prayer book of 1740-odd, in a rather handsome binding. I'll just go and get it. It's in my room. He left us in a state of some surprise, but we had hardly time to exchange any remarks when he was back, panting, and handed us the book opened at the flyleaf, on which was, in a straggly hand, Nathaniel Ager is my name, and England is my nation. Seaburgh is my dwelling place, and Christ is my salvation. When I am dead and in my grave, and all my bones are rotten, I hope the Lord will think on me when I am quite forgotten. This poem was dated 1754, and there were more entries of Agers, Nathaniel, Frederick, William, and so on, ending with William, 19. You see, he said, anybody would call it the greatest bit of luck. I did, but I don't now. Of course, I asked the shopman about William Ager, and of course he happened to remember that he lodged in a cottage in the North Field, and died there. This was just chalking the road for me. I knew which the cottage must be. There's only one sizable one about there. The next thing was to scrape some sort of acquaintance with the people, and I took a walk that way at once. A dog did the business for me. He made at me so fiercely that they had to run out and beat him off, and then naturally begged my pardon, and we got into talk. I had only to bring up Age's name and pretend I knew or thought I knew something of him, and then the woman said how sad it was, him dying so young, and she was sure it came of him spending the night out of doors in the cold weather. Then I had to say, did he go out on the sea at night? And she said, oh, no, it was on the hillock yonder, with the trees on it. And there I was. I know something about digging in these barrows. I have opened many of them in the down country, but that was with the owner's leave, and in broad daylight, and with men to help. I had to prospect very carefully here before I put a spade in. I couldn't trench across the mound, and with those old firs growing there, I knew there would be awkward tree roots. Still, the soil was very light and sandy and easy, and there was a rabbit hole or so that might be developed into a sort of tunnel. The going out and coming back at odd hours to the hotel was going to be the awkward part. When I made up my mind about the way to excavate, I told the people that I was called away for a night, and I spent it out there. I made my tunnel. I won't bore you with the details of how I supported it and filled it in when I'd done, but the main thing is that I got the crown. Naturally, we both broke out into exclamations of surprise and interest. I, for one, had long known about the finding of the crown at Rendlesham, and had often lamented its fate. No one has ever seen an Anglo-Saxon crown, at least no one had, but our man gazed at us with a rueful eye. Yes, he said, and the worst of it is I don't know how to put it back. Put it back? We cried out. Why, my dear sir, you've made one of the most exciting finds ever heard of in this country. Of course, it ought to go to the jewel house at the Tower. What's your difficulty? If you're thinking about the owner of the land and treasure trove and all that, we can certainly help you through. Nobody's going to make a fuss about technicalities in a case of this kind. Probably more was said, but all he did was to put his face in his hands and mutter, I don't know how to put it back. At last Long said, you'll forgive me, I hope, if I seem impertinent, but are you quite sure you've got it? I was wanting to ask much the same question myself, for of course the story did seem a lunatic's dream when one thought it over, but I hadn't quite dared to say what might hurt the poor young man's feelings. However, he took it quite calmly, really, with the calm of despair, you might say. He sat up and said, oh yes, there's no doubt about that. I have it here in my room, locked up in my bag. You can come and look at it if you like. I won't offer to bring it here. We were not likely to let the chance slip. We went with him. His room was only a few doors off. The Boots was just collecting shoes in the passage, or so we thought. Afterwards, we were not sure. Our visitor, his name was Paxton, was in a worse state of shivers than before, and went hurriedly into the room and beckoned us after him, turned on the light, and shut the door carefully. Then he unlocked his kit bag and produced a bundle of clean pocket handkerchiefs, in which something was wrapped, laid it on the bed, and undid it. I can say now I have seen an actual Anglo-Saxon crown. It was of silver, as the Rendlesham one is always said to have been. It was set with some gems, mostly antique intaglios and cameos, and was of rather plain and almost rough workmanship. In fact, it was like those you see on the coins and in the manuscripts. I found no reason to think it was later than the 9th century. I was intensely interested, of course, and I wanted to turn it over in my hands, but Paxton prevented me. Don't you touch it, he said. I'll do that. And with a sigh that was, I declare to you, dreadful to hear, he took it up and turned it about so that we could see every part of it. Seen enough? He said at last, and we nodded. He wrapped it up and locked it in his bag and stood looking at us dumbly. Come back to our room, Long said, and tell us what the trouble is. He thanked us and said, Will you go first and see if the coast's clear? That wasn't very intelligible, for our proceedings hadn't been, after all, very suspicious, and the hotel, as I said, was practically empty. However, we were beginning to have inklings of we didn't know what, and anyhow, nerves are infectious. So we did go, first peering out as we opened the door, and fancying, I found we both had the fancy, that a shadow, or more than a shadow, but it made no sound, passed from before us to one side as we came out into the passage. "It's all right," we whispered to Paxton. Whispering seemed the proper tone, and we went, with him between us, back to our sitting room. I was preparing, when we got there, to be ecstatic about the unique interest of what we had seen, but when I looked at Paxton, I saw that would be terribly out of place, and I left it to him to begin. "What is to be done?" was his opening. Long thought it right, as he explained to me afterwards, to be obtuse, and said, "Why not find out who the owner of the land is? "Oh, no," Paxton broke in impatiently. "I beg your pardon, you've been very kind, but don't you see it's got to go back, and I daren't be there at night, and daytime's impossible. Perhaps, though, you don't see. Well then, the truth is that I've never been alone since I touched it." I was beginning some fairly stupid comment, but Long caught my eye, and I stopped. Long said, "I think I do see, perhaps, but wouldn't it be a relief to tell us a little more clearly what the situation is?" Then it all came out. Paxton looked over his shoulder and beckoned to us to come nearer to him, and began speaking in a low voice. We listened most intently, of course, and compared notes afterwards. And I wrote down our version, so I'm confident I have what he told us, almost word for word. He said, "It began when I was first prospecting. A man standing by one of the firs. This was in daylight, you know. He was never in front of me. I always saw him with the tail of my eye on the left or the right, and he was never there when I looked straight for him. I would lie down for quite a long time and take careful observations and make sure there was no one. And then, when I got up and began prospecting again, there he was. And he began to give me hints besides, for wherever I put that prayer book, short of locking it up, which I did at last, when I came back to my room, it was always out on my table, open at the fly-leaf where the names are, and one of my razors across it to keep it open. I'm sure he just can't open my bag, or something more would have happened. You see, he's so light and weak. But all the same, I daren't face him. Well then, when I was making the tunnel, of course it was worse, and if I hadn't been so keen, I should have dropped the whole thing and run. It was like someone scraping at my back all the time. I thought for a long time it was only soil dropping on me, but as I got nearer the crown, it was unmistakable. And when I actually laid it bare and got my fingers into the ring of it and pulled it out, there came a sort of cry behind me. Oh, I can't tell you how desolate it was, and horribly threatening, too. It spoiled all my pleasure in my find, cut it off that moment, and if I hadn't been the wretched fool I am, I should have put the thing back and left it. But I didn't. The rest of the time was just awful. I had hours to get through before I could decently come back to the hotel. First, I spent time filling up my tunnel and covering my tracks, and all the while he was there, trying to thwart me. Sometimes, you know, you see him, and sometimes you don't. Just as he pleases, I think. He's there, but he has some power over your eyes. Well, I wasn't off the spot very long before sunrise, and then I had to get to the junction for Seaburgh and take a train back. And though it was daylight fairly soon, I don't know if that made it much better. There were always hedges or gorse bushes or park fences along the road, some sort of cover, I mean, and I was never easy for a second. And then, when I began to meet people going to work, they always looked behind me, very strangely. It might have been that they were surprised at seeing anyone so early, but I didn't think it was only that. And I don't now. They didn't look exactly at me. And the porter at the train was like that too. And the guard held open the door after I'd got into the carriage, just as he would if there was somebody else coming, you know. "Oh, you may be very sure it isn't my fancy," he said with a dull sort of laugh. Then he went on, "And even if I do get it put back, he won't forgive me. I can tell that." And I was so happy a fortnight ago. He dropped into a chair, and I believe he began to cry. We didn't know what to say, but we felt we must come to the rescue somehow, and so, it really seemed the only thing, we said if he was so set on putting the crown back in its place, we would help him. And I must say that after what we had heard, it did seem the right thing. If these horrid consequences had come on this poor man, might there not really be something in the original idea of the crown having some curious power bound up with it to guard the coast? At least, that was my feeling, and I think it was Long's too. Our offer was very welcome to Paxton anyhow. When could we do it? It was nearing 10:30. Could we contrive to make a late walk plausible to the hotel people that very night? We looked out of the window. There was a brilliant full moon, the Paschal moon. Long undertook to tackle the boots and propitiate him. He was to say that we should not be much over the hour, and if we did find it so pleasant that we stopped out a bit longer, we would see to it that he didn't lose by sitting up. Well, we were pretty regular customers of the hotel, and didn't give them much trouble, and were considered by the servants to be not under the mark in the way of tips, and so the boots was propitiated, and let us out onto the seafront, and remained, as we heard later, looking after us. Paxton had a large coat over his arm, under which was the wrapped-up crown. So we were off on this strange errand before we had time to think how very much out of the way it was. I have told this part quite shortly on purpose, for it really does represent the haste with which we settled our plan and took action. "The shortest way is up the hill and through the churchyard," Paxton said, as we stood a moment before the hotel, looking up and down the front. There was nobody about, nobody at all. Seaburgh, out of the season, is an early, quiet place. "We can't go along the dyke by the cottage because of the dog," Paxton also said, when I pointed to what I thought a shorter way along the front and across 2 fields. The reason he gave was good enough. We went up the road to the church and turned in at the churchyard gate. I confess to having thought that there might be some lying there who might be conscious of our business. But if it was so, they were also conscious that one who was on their side, so to say, had us under surveillance, and we saw no sign of them. But under observation we felt we were, as I have never felt it at another time. Specially was it so when we passed out of the churchyard into a narrow path with close high hedges, through which we hurried as Christian did through that valley, and so got out into open fields. Then, along hedges, though I would sooner have been in the open, where I could see if anyone was visible behind me, over a gate or two, and then a swerve to the left, taking us up onto the ridge which ended in that mound. As we neared it, Henry Long felt, and I felt too, that there were what I can only call dim presences waiting for us, as well as a far more actual one attending us. Of Paxton's agitation all this time I can give you no adequate picture. He breathed like a hunted beast, and we could not either of us look at his face. How he would manage when we got to that very place we had not troubled to think. He had seemed so sure that that would not be difficult. Nor was it. I never saw anything like the dash with which he flung himself at that particular spot in the side of the mound and tore at it, so that in a very few minutes the greater part of his body was out of sight. We stood, holding the coat and that bundle of handkerchiefs, and looking very fearfully, I must admit, about us. There was nothing to be seen. A line of dark firs behind us made one skyline, more trees and the church tower half a mile off on the right, cottages and a windmill on the horizon on the left, calm sea dead in front, faint barking of a dog at a cottage on a gleaming dyke between us and it, full moon making that path we know across the sea, the eternal whisper of the Scotch firs just above us and of the sea in front. Yet, in all this quiet, an acute, an acrid consciousness of a restrained hostility very near us, like a dog on a leash that might be let go at any moment. Paxton pulled himself out of the hole and stretched a hand back to us. "Give it to me," he whispered. "Unwrapped." We pulled off the handkerchiefs, and he took the crown. The moonlight just fell on it as he snatched it. We had not ourselves touched that bit of metal, and I have thought since that it was just as well. In another moment Paxton was out of the hole again, and busy shovelling back the soil with hands that were already bleeding. He would have none of our help, though. It was much the longest part of the job to get the place to look undisturbed, yet, I don't know how, he made a wonderful success of it. At last he was satisfied, and we turned back. We were a couple of 100 yards from the hill when Long suddenly said to him, "I say, you've left your coat there. That won't do. See?" And I certainly did see it, the long dark overcoat lying where the tunnel had been. Paxton had not stopped, however. He only shook his head and held up the coat on his arm. And when we joined him, he said, without any excitement, but as if nothing mattered any more, "That wasn't my coat." And indeed, when we looked back, the dark thing was not to be seen. Well, we got out onto the road and came rapidly back that way. It was well before 12 when we got in, trying to put a good face on it and saying, Long and I, what a lovely night it was for a walk. The Boots was on the lookout for us, and we made remarks like that for his edification as we entered the hotel. He gave another look up and down the seafront before he locked the front door and said, "You didn't meet many people about, I suppose, sir?" "No, indeed, not a soul," I said, at which I remember Paxton looked oddly at me. "Only I thought I see someone turn up the station road after you, gentlemen," said the Boots. "Still, you was 3 together, and I don't suppose he meant mischief." I didn't know what to say. Long merely said, "Good night," and we went off upstairs, promising to turn out all lights and to go to bed in a few minutes. Back in our room, we did our very best to make Paxton take a cheerful view. "There's the crown safe back," we said, "and very likely you'd have done better not to touch it," and he heavily assented to that. But no real harm has been done, and we shall never give this away to anyone who'd be so mad as to go near it. Besides, don't you feel better yourself? "I don't mind confessing," I said, "that on the way there I was very much inclined to take your view about being followed. But going back, it wasn't at all the same thing, was it?" "No, it wouldn't do. You've got nothing to trouble yourselves about," he said, "but I'm not forgiven. I've got to pay for that miserable sacrilege still. I know what you're going to say. The church might help. Yes, but it's the body that has to suffer. It's true, I'm not feeling that he's waiting outside for me just now. But—" Then he stopped. Then he turned to thanking us, and we put him off as soon as we could. And naturally we pressed him to use our sitting room next day, and said we should be glad to go out with him. Or did he play golf, perhaps? Yes, he did, but he didn't think he should care about that tomorrow. Well, we recommended him to get up late and sit in our room in the morning while we were playing, and we would have a walk later in the day. He was very submissive and piano about it, ready to do just what we thought best, but clearly quite certain in his own mind that what was coming could not be averted or palliated. You wonder why we didn't insist on accompanying him to his home and seeing him safe into the care of brothers or someone. The fact was, he had nobody. He had had a flat in town, but lately he had made his mind up to settle for a time in Sweden, and he had dismantled his flat and shipped off his belongings, and was whiling away a fortnight or 3 weeks before he made a start. Anyway, we didn't see what we could do better than sleep on it, or not sleep very much, as was my case, and see what we felt like tomorrow morning. We felt very different, Long and I, on as beautiful an April morning as you could desire. And Paxton also looked very different when we saw him at breakfast. The first approach to a decent night I seem ever to have had, was what he said. But he was going to do as we had settled, stay in probably all the morning and come out with us later. We went to the links. We met some other men and played with them in the morning, and had lunch there rather early so as not to be late back. All the same, the snares of death overtook him. Whether it could have been prevented, I don't know. I think he would have been got at somehow, do what we might. Anyway, this is what happened. We went straight up to our room. Paxton was there, reading quite peaceably. "Ready to come out shortly," said Long. "Say in half an hour's time?" "Certainly," he said. And I said we would change first, and perhaps have baths, and call for him in half an hour. I had my bath first, and went and lay down on my bed, and slept for about 10 minutes. We came out of our rooms at the same time, and we went together to the sitting room. Paxton wasn't there, only his book. Nor was he in his room, nor in the downstairs rooms. We shouted for him. A servant came out and said, "Why, I thought you gentlemen was gone out already, and so did the other gentleman. He heard you a calling from the path there and run out in a hurry, and I looked out of the coffee room window, but I didn't see you. However, he run off down the beach, that way." Without a word, we ran that way too. It was the opposite direction to that of last night's expedition. It wasn't quite 4 o'clock, and the day was fair, though not so fair as it had been. So there was really no reason, you'd say, for anxiety. With people about, surely a man couldn't come to much harm. But something in our look as we ran out must have struck the servant, for she came out on the steps and pointed and said, "Yes, that's the way he went." We ran on as far as the top of the shingle bank, and there pulled up. There was a choice of ways, past the houses on the seafront, or along the sand at the bottom of the beach, which, the tide being now out, was fairly broad. Or, of course, we might keep along the shingle between these 2 tracks and have some view of both of them, only that was heavy going. We chose the sand, for that was the loneliest, and someone might come to harm there, without being seen from the public path. Long said he saw Paxton some distance ahead, running and waving his stick, as if he wanted to signal to people who were on ahead of him. I couldn't be sure. One of these sea mists was coming up very quickly from the south. There was someone, that's all I could say, and there were tracks on the sand, as of someone running who wore shoes. And there were other tracks made before those, for the shoes sometimes trod in them and interfered with them, of someone not in shoes. Oh, of course, it's only my word you've got to take for all of this. Long's dead, we'd no time or means to make sketches or take casts, and the next tide washed everything away. All we could do was to notice these marks as we hurried on, but there they were over and over again, and we had no doubt whatever that what we saw was the track of a bare foot, and one that showed more bones than flesh. The notion of Paxton running after anything like this, and supposing it to be the friends he was looking for, was very dreadful to us. You can guess what we fancied, how the thing he was following might stop suddenly and turn round on him, and what sort of face it would show, half seen at first in the mist, which all the while was getting thicker and thicker. And as I ran on, wondering how the poor wretch could have been lured into mistaking that other thing for us, I remembered his saying, "He has some power over your eyes," and then I wondered what the end would be. for I had no hope now that the end could be averted, and, well, there is no need to tell all the dismal and horrid thoughts that flitted through my head as we ran on into the mist. It was uncanny, too, that the sun should still be bright in the sky, and we could see nothing. We could only tell that we were now past the houses, and had reached that gap there is between them and the old Martello Tower. When you're past the tower, you know, there's nothing but shingle for a long way, not a house, not a human creature, just that spit of land, or rather shingle, with the river on your right and the sea on your left. But just before that, just by the Martello Tower, you remember there's the old battery close to the sea. I believe there are only a few blocks of concrete left now. The rest has all been washed away. But at this time there was a lot more, though the place was a ruin. Well, when we got there, we clambered to the top as quick as we could to take breath and look over the shingle in front, if by chance the mist would let us see anything. But a moment's rest we must have. We had run a mile at least. Nothing whatever was visible ahead of us, and we were just turning by common consent to get down and run hopelessly on, when we heard what I can only call a laugh. And if you understand what I mean by a breathless, a lungless laugh, you have it. But I don't suppose you can. It came from below and swerved away into the mist. That was enough. We bent over the wall. Paxton was there, at the bottom. You don't need to be told that he was dead. His tracks showed that he had run along the side of the battery, had turned sharp round the corner of it, and, small doubt of it, must have dashed straight into the open arms of someone who was waiting there. His mouth was full of sand and stones, and his teeth and jaws were broken to bits. I only glanced once at his face. At the same moment, just as we were scrambling down from the battery to get to the body, we heard a shout and saw a man running down the bank of the Martello Tower. He was the caretaker stationed there, and his keen old eyes had managed to descry through the mist that something was wrong. He had seen Paxton fall, and had seen us a moment after, running up. Fortunate this, for otherwise we could hardly have escaped suspicion of being concerned in the dreadful business. Had he, we asked, caught sight of anybody attacking our friend? He couldn't be sure. We sent him off for help, and stayed by the dead man till they came with the stretcher. It was then that we traced out how he had come, on the narrow fringe of sand under the battery wall. The rest was shingle, and it was hopelessly impossible to tell whither the other had gone. What were we to say at the inquest? It was a duty we felt not to give up there and then the secret of the crown, to be published in every paper. I don't know how much you would have told, but what we did agree upon was this, to say that we had only made acquaintance with Paxton the day before, and that he had told us that he was under some apprehension of danger at the hands of a man called William Ager. Also that we had seen some other tracks, besides Paxton's, when we followed him along the beach. But of course by that time everything was gone from the sands. No one had any knowledge, fortunately, of any William Ager living in the district. The evidence of the man at the Martello Tower freed us from all suspicion. All that could be done was to return a verdict of wilful murder by some person or persons unknown. Paxton was so totally without connections that all the inquiries that were subsequently made ended in a no thoroughfare. And I have never been at Seaburgh, or even near it, since. Before I start talking about the story, and remember you can actually switch off if you don't want to hear that, I've been listening to Old Gods of Appalachia, and I noticed they do a little preamble. They do it before the story as well, but they also have a bit saying, come along and join our Patreon. If you don't like ads, come and become a patron. If you become a patron, you get all the stories I've ever done on this podcast to download free of charge with no ads So if that appeals to you, hop on over to www.patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud. That's me. So if you want to do that, I'd be absolutely delighted. And we can have a chat on the app there. But if you don't want to do that, then just listen to my commentary or switch off and go to sleep. So that was A Warning to the Curious by M.R. James. And funnily enough, we've just done Casting the Runes last week, so we've got 2 M.R. James stories in a row after not doing any for months and months and months. And this story was sponsored by Gavin Critchley, and you might know that Gavin actually every quarter, without fail, he generously provides me a sum of money to sit down and record a story for your delectation. And he suggested this one, The Warning to the Curious, because I'd never done it. There are certain authors who I admire that I not avoid, but do less than perhaps I should, because other people do them really well. And so H.P. Lovecraft is another one. I think Lovecraft wrote some great stories that I'd like to do. But Ian Gordon of Horror Babble has done them all amazingly. So, it's almost like I'm not adding anything. And I know that people such as Bite Sized Audio have done a lot of M.R. James as well. And so I'm very, very humble in that presence. You may also be aware of Robert Lloyd Parry, who is with his Nunky Theatre, and he travels the world really doing M.R. James stories. And as somebody points out, he looks rather like M.R. James as well, which helps. And whether he is naturally like that or he's had plastic surgery or something. But in any case, he is the master of this. And so I am hesitant to kind of even step on the stage really. Let's say something about M.R. James. We know about M.R. James, talked about him last week. Born in 1862, 1936, he died. He was an English manuscript expert, provost of King's College, Cambridge, and later of Eton College, where he'd previously gone to school. Best known today for his ghost stories. Born in Kent, was always interested in antiquarian subjects, I managed to get it in the end, and medieval studies from a young age, and he pursued those in his education. He became assistant director of the Fitzwilliam Museum. You know all of these things. He began writing his ghost stories in the 1890s to entertain friends and colleagues, most famously reading them out at Christmas. A Warning to the Curious, one of his most celebrated tales, was first published in the London Mercury in 1925 and later included in his 1925 collection, A Warning to the Curious and Other Ghost Stories. As you know, the story is set in the fictional coastal town of Seaburgh, and it was written just a few years after the end of World War I, and is notable for its dark, pessimistic tone, which reflects the profound impact of the war on British society when millions were killed, really. In A Warning to the Curious, M.R. James draws upon the rich tradition of magical artefacts and talismans believed to protect Britain from harm. This story centres around the legend of the 3 crowns buried along the East Anglian coast to safeguard the nation from invasion. This premise taps, and remember he says if they were still there, the Germans would never land, and they didn't land. So this premise taps into a deep-seated fascination with the idea of magical protection, which is echoed in various other myths and legends throughout British history. For instance, the Glastonbury Thorn, a hawthorn tree, said to have sprung from the staff of Joseph of Arimathea, is believed to ensure the sanctity and protection of Glastonbury as long as it thrives. Some people say the whole of the kingdom. Similarly, the buried head of Bendigeidfran, Bran the Blessed at Tower Hill in London, was buried there and was thought to ward off invasion until King Arthur dug it up, and in his hubris, and then Britain got invaded by the Saxons and then by the Normans. So and then the other one, of course, related to the Tower of London is the myth, or maybe it's not a myth, of the ravens. And it's said if the ravens ever leave the Tower of London, the monarchy and the nation will collapse, the kingdom will fall. And so, although he doesn't, he would have known these legends, James, and he's familiar with the idea of buried, antiquarian, magical, that's what they are, artifacts, and they protect the kingdom from invasion. Yeah. So that is the first thing to talk about. This is not him inventing this idea. It is mentioned in other sources, this idea of the burying of particularly the head of Bendigeid Bran is buried as these crowns were. So he mentions the crown of Redwald, an ancient East Anglian king, as one of the 3 buried crowns believed to protect England from invasion. Yeah, this reference to Redwald and his crown is particularly significant given the 1939 discovery of the Sutton Hoo treasure. Now, if you ever in the British Museum, you can see this fantastic Anglo-Saxon hoard. Really, really amazing. I think the crown is gold. Or I don't know if there is a crown there. Actually, I can't remember, but I know there's this fantastic Anglo-Saxon warrior's helmet. Very, very lovely. This was discovered kind of 14 years after the publication of A Warning to the Curious, but it was thought to be Redwald's crown, or his treasure. If you haven't seen, there was a film called The Dig with Ralph Fiennes in it about the amateur archaeologist, again an amateur archaeologist, which is interesting given Paxton, but of course this is written before the event, so it's almost like art preceding fact. There is a phrase there. I don't know why I'm so tired. I'm stumbling on my words. So yeah, I think that's interesting. That happens later. So clearly James is deeply steeped in East Anglian history and legend and folklore. In A Warning to the Curious, James sets the story in the fictional coastal town of Seaburgh, which is based on the real-life town of Aldeburgh in Suffolk, which I've never been to, which I'm hoping to get to one of these days. James had strong personal connections to Aldeburgh, as his maternal grandmother, Mary Emily Horton Hawes, lived in the town, and he frequently visited and holidayed there during his life. James, particularly his early life. So when he talks about how he paint at the very beginning, he paints a picture of the town. That's his love for the town, and he says he can't help it when he thinks about it. These things crawl out of his pencil. That sounds rather disgusting, but yeah. So, he clearly knows the landmarks. The Martello Tower, where Paxton is killed, is real, built during the Napoleonic Wars, and the inn, the Bear, is probably the White Lion Hotel, a real inn where James himself used to visit. The interesting thing about this is folk horror before folk horror was a thing. So folk horror kind of became a genre in the 1970s, but it's present here. So folk horror typically explores the dark side of rural landscapes, ancient traditions and forgotten beliefs. Folk horror often involves a clash between modernity and the lingering presence of the past, with protagonists encountering ancient evil or supernatural forces deeply rooted in the landscape and local folklore. You can see that here. Tick, tick, tick. Yeah, James's story exemplifies these themes through its depiction of the East Anglian coast, steeped in legend and haunted by the ghost of William Ager. Now, I've chosen to pronounce it Ager. I don't know how you do pronounce it. Ager, it could be. Ager, the guardian of the buried crown. There's this kind of idea of a family which have this task of looking after. This has been used in folk horror-y stories again. This isn't the first folk horror story. If we think of H.R. Wakefield's The First Sheaf, which I've done on the podcast, published in 1922, and this also delves into the dark side of rural traditions. I think that's in Lincolnshire, which is just a bit to the north and west of Suffolk. So a dark side of rural traditions and the supernatural, featuring a sinister ritual involving the sacrifice of the first sheaf. Yeah, it's true. The enduring power of ancient beliefs and the potential for violence and horror to lurk beneath the surface of seemingly innocent folkways. So the first sheaf, which is about this rural community that has pagan survival views. And we have, that's 1922. 1925, we have A Warning to the Curious, which is about, the buried crown of the ancient kings, which are protected by a line of local people. And I think it's worth flagging up the context. In 1921 was a very Margaret Murray did a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe. Okay, published in 1921, just a few years, kind of suggested this was the zeitgeist. The 1920s were a time of great interest in the occult, the supernatural, and the idea of lost or forgotten knowledge. So the idea, Margaret Murray's book says, the theory that the witch trials of early modern Europe were actually an attempt to suppress a pre-Christian pagan religion that had survived in secret for centuries. Okay, so this was a thing. They thought it was debunked, really, but that the witches had this was pagan survivals, that there was an authentic thread of a pagan survival from pre-Christian times. And so it seems to me, not necessarily pre-Christian, but this idea of rural places having traditions that are rooted in historical fact, if you like, the East Anglian kings, and magic as well. So, or rooted in an age that believes in legend and magic, such as the ages protecting the crowns and the buried crowns. So that is 1921, the witch cult in Western Europe, and it is producing. It's hard to say whether it's all a product of the same current of interest in things like this, or that Wakefield and M.R. James read the witch cult in Western Europe. I don't have no evidence to say that. Of course, at that time, James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, which is a seminal study of comparative religion and mythology and a lot of pagan stuff, was very, very popular in those days. Another theme we need to talk about, perhaps, is the Great War. We hinted at it before. So the Great War saw millions of ordinary people across Western Europe, really. And in fact, I remember being in Turkey and seeing war memorials from the First War, the Great War. And every little village in Britain has a war memorial with a list of names, often a quite long list of the soldiers who went out and died with this great fervour. They kind of bought into the idea that it was their duty, that and it was it's not, we haven't got time here, or I haven't got sophisticated enough knowledge to go into the causes of the First World War, although I remember studying it in history. And it was that we said Kaiser Wilhelm didn't really think it would end up as war. One thing led to another. It was kind of I don't think anybody planned on the war. It was this saber rattling and almost like kids in a playground. I'm tougher than you. You don't dare do this to me. And unfortunately, it all, the Archduke Ferdinand was shot by a Serb. The Serbs are Slavs, use a Cyrillic alphabet, and our Orthodox, so the Russians, stepped in to protect them, and it kind of plunged the whole of Europe into a tremendously even isn't even a strong enough word, bloody conflict that killed. And these local lads would go off singing, thinking it was important. They were going to do something for their communities and for freedom and all of this one. In fact, all it was not even whims, I can't think of the right word, of I'm going to say it, the kingly elites, the emperors, playing with these people's lives. It meant nothing to them. How could it improve the life of a young person in Suffolk, a young man in Suffolk, to go and be brutalised and butchered in the trenches of Western Europe? So I don't think anybody really these days thinks that the First World War was a great thing. But, so I'm not saying anything new here. But it was astonishing how, and it just shows you, how governments and leaders can whip up enthusiasm amongst ordinary people through the use of the media and things like that, to get them wholeheartedly behind a cause which in hindsight is at best absurd, tragic and criminal, Anyway, let's not go any further into that. So, Paxton, it's 1925. It was written probably before that, so it was written after the First World War. So Paxton, this is a young man who he's going to Sweden, isn't he? and he's filling in time before he goes to Sweden. So what does he do for a living? Why is he not working? He's adrift from the world. And I know that a lot of these writers, particularly people like E.F. Benson, are writing in this Edwardian and interwar period, and they don't have anything to do because they don't need to work. And it may be that he is wealthy, but there's no real sign that he's particularly wealthy, because he's staying in a kind of pretty ordinary hotel. It's nothing fancy. There are no signs of luxury about him. And he's a man who has time to indulge his interests, one of which is amateur archaeology. So is he not refugee, is he a victim of the war? And the other, although he doesn't die in that way, this picture of him lying in the grit and the sand with dirt in his mouth and his jaw smashed and broken inevitably brings you pictures of those soldiers who were smashed and broken in the mud of the Western Front. And so, and even if it was intended or not intended, his tragic fate and the story's dark, pessimistic tone reflect the deep scars left by the conflict on British society and the individual psyche, and so they are in the atmosphere. Now, I want to kind of jump forward a little bit and talk about Jacques Derrida, the great postmodern philosopher. And some people don't like postmodernism. I think it's really interesting, intertextuality and what is true and all that kind of stuff. But so let's talk about Derrida's concept of hauntology, which explores the persistent presence of the past in the present, and the ways in which the spectral, i.e. the non-existent, can disrupt or destabilize our understanding of reality. Is that not what we're seeing here? The past is absolutely present here in the present, and its influence determines the outcome, really. So hauntology, Derrida's hauntology suggests that the present is always already haunted by the ghosts of the past, and that these spectres can exert a powerful influence on our lives and perception, So, and we look at this in the context of the story, the ancient crown and its ghostly guardian, William Ager, embody this idea of the past haunting the present. The crown itself, a relic of East Anglia's Anglo-Saxon history, represents a bygone era that refuses to remain buried, literally and metaphorically. Its unearthing by Paxton sets in motion a series of events that demonstrate the power of the past to disrupt and unsettle the present. More than that, even. Age's spectral presence, which relentlessly pursues Paxton, can be seen as a manifestation of the return of the repressed, a figure of the past that demands recognition and retribution. And there was a guy called Mark Fisher, who many people listening to this will know about. He took his life, sadly, in 2017. And he talked about hauntology and in cultural film, music studies, literary studies. And he extends Derrida's ideas to encompass the ways in which our collective cultural memory and imagination are haunted by the unfulfilled promises and lost futures of the past. And I think that's really interesting. So, not only, as Derrida would have it, is the present haunted by the past, it is haunted by the past's anticipation of the future, the lost future. This is, if you are into, the guy who does the music for this podcast, Jonathan Sharp, with the Hartwood Institute. He does a lot of hauntology, and there's a whole genre. And if you're interested in that kind of ambient electronic, often using samples of past films, such as you tried to get into the Locked Door today from the movie Psychomania from the 1970s. So in the 70s, I don't know if you're around then, but you remember everybody was filled. I remember being a boy, and everybody was filled with this idea of, we're all going to be we'll all be eating pills instead of food. We're going to be going to Mars and Venus and living in space. Our houses are going to be completely robotic, and there'll be robot servants everywhere. And there was a sense of almost of futurism and optimism that the future would be a utopia. It would be better than now. I'm not sure we have that right now. I think many of us feel that the future, I say us, I'm not sure I'm convinced about that. I think I'm relatively optimistic. But, there is a feeling that you were going to hell in a handcart. But I think when we go back to the 70s, and so we had that hope that things would be better through technology. And now we are nostalgic for the past, for the future that never happened. So we're nostalgic for a lost future, a future that we dreamed of, that we anticipated, that never happened. Okay, and that's hauntology, according to Fisher, which is a development of Derrida's idea of, the past is haunted by the present. Fisher's saying the past is haunted by the past's anticipation of the present, if that makes sense. Okay, so lost futures. Let's look at Paxton in the terms of lost futures. His tragic fate can be interpreted as a metaphor for the lost potential and unfilled promises of a generation scarred by war. So I was talking about the 1970s and my generation looking forward to a brighter future, the bright light of technology, and now we're nostalgic for that. That never happened. It was wasted, perhaps. It was lost in any case. How, perhaps even more true, these people who survived the First World War, they thought they were fighting for freedom, for justice, for a better world. And we know what happened. Most of the soldiers, if they weren't killed, they were out of work. They were maimed. There was an immense, I can only talk about Britain. If you read Hilaire Belloc's work about wandering in Sussex, and you get this idea that the byways it were full of people walking the country looking for work. They had to walk because they couldn't afford any other form of transport. So they were like tramps, gentlemen of the road, and some of them preferred to stay that way. But they moved from place to place to place to place seeking work. So their future that they'd been fighting for was not delivered at all. And so when we look at hauntology and being haunted by our anticipation of a better future that never happened, a lost future, I think we can definitely see an echo of that in how potentially that generation must have viewed in the 20s, in the mid-20s, 1920s, not 2020s, 100 years ago, they must have viewed their lost futures that they'd hoped for. Now, I think of my great-grandfather was... I've told this story before, I think. So my great-grandfather was a coal miner. And his brother, he was Tom, and his brother Joseph was an engineer. He worked on the railways. He worked on the railways that supplied the coal mines. So he was an engineer. And he was also a volunteer soldier, a sapper in the Royal Engineers. And at the Battle of the Somme, because he was a volunteer, he went to war. And there was a battalion that went forward at Bayersin Ridge, I think, and they were hit by artillery, German artillery, and pretty much all of them killed. So my great-grandfather Tom, although he didn't have to go to war because it was a reserved occupation being a coal miner, within days of his brother being killed on the Western Front, he signed up to join the Border Regiment, and he ended up in the Dorset Regiment. I think what happened was the units were so blasted and decimated that they just kind of cobbled them together, and so he ended up in the Dorset Regiment, which is a long way from Cumberland. And in any case, and he came home. Now, I don't think he was ever right. He was gassed as well, and I don't think he was ever right. And I remember my grandmother, who loved her dad to bits, and she said that they moved to Blackpool, seeking a better life. And when the Second World War came, he volunteered as an air raid warden because he wasn't fit to fight at that time, and he was an air raid warden, and he died in 1940 of a heart attack, I think. And so I don't know. And this is this whole issue of us imagining futures and imagining things. But I wonder if his experiences on the Western Front basically shortened his life, and so I only give that personal story because it's relevant, I think, to this whole generation of people, potentially including Paxton. Okay, so by examining, this is my final paragraph, by examining A Warning to the Curious through the lens of Derrida's hauntology and Fisher's elaboration of the concept, we can appreciate the ways in which James's story grapples with the persistent presence of the past and the spectral forces that shape our understanding of the present. We are haunted by the past. The story's exploration of the consequences of unearthing buried treasures and its evocation of a society haunted by the spectres of war and lost futures continue to resonate with readers, reminding us of the enduring power of the ghost story to illuminate the dark corners of our collective psyche. Yeah, what do you think of that? So there we are. I think on two levels, there's Paxton as the man in almost a naturalistic way of looking at it. So what was it like for that generation after the First World War, and how removed from ordinary life they were by their experiences, although we're just speculating this because none of this is in the story. And then we have his lost future, and then we have the kind of classic haunting of the past. It's hard to know. The other thing to talk about, because we could talk about it for days, well, hours certainly, is this idea of the horror genre, which was brought forward by another guy I quote a lot, Blake Snyder, also deceased, who was a screenwriter, and he said with the horror genre, there is a sin that lets the monster in. So what is the sin? I think the sin is in the title, A Warning to the Curious. Don't stick your nose in things. And this is often the sin in ghost stories and horror stories. I'm just reading Hell House by Richard Matheson, and again, the sin there is curiosity. We could maybe elaborate. It's a longer book than that, but so I think this is the problem that M.R. James outlines. Don't go sticking your nose. And this is many of his characters. This is where they fall foul of the past. It's almost like there are things you're not supposed to know, and you should just leave well alone. I think that's the message, isn't it? And of course, that is not a very human thing to leave well alone. We don't seem to be able to do it. And James was a very conservative man, reactionary, some people called him. Now, that sparks Russell Kirk to my head. Now, Russell Kirk's the American conservative writer. And of course, in conservative thought, traditions and hierarchies are really important. The importance of rootedness. I mean, Tolkien was as well, really. And this idea of the past and your rootedness in the past, and the traditions of the past, which are important and they must be preserved, and those who defile those traditions are punished. And I think that's what we see here is Paxton, who digs up the past. And he shouldn't do it according to this kind of ideology. You should leave the past. You should respect it. You should respect tradition. Like the ages, they have a role. There's a hierarchy. Things must be respected. So I think that's another way of looking at it. But we could talk about this story. There's a lot to say about it, and we could talk about the Jungian aspect of it. I'm very fond of doing, whereby the ages are some kind of shadow. Paxton's inability to integrate the shadow leads to a failed individuation and his untimely death. He fails the task that nature has given him and pays the price. Now, some of these interpretations, I've been very wide-ranging, really, talking about Tolkien, Jung, Derrida, Mark Fisher, Blake Snyder, and we could even look at it from a Marxist angle, but let's not. And Russell Kirk. And so, I think the thing to say is, let's just stop talking about it now. No, what I was going to say is, it's a stretch. Some of these may be a stretch, and you may be thinking, oh no, come on. But I think some of them there are interesting ways to look at it anyway. I'm not saying Monty meant any of this. He meant some of it maybe. But I think there are. Somebody was saying about stories. The reason that we can find so much in stories that perhaps the author didn't intend is because he's mining the collective unconscious. This is very Jungian. So he's mining our common human inheritance. There we have it.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so? 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 Come back.